Technology and Innovation, and I'm a co-investigator in the UKRI node on the governance and regulation of trusted autonomous systems. And I guess most of the people on the call know what that is because they're the main audience here. And we're delighted to welcome Nina Markl, who is just about to join us as a researcher here, and is just also at the same time finishing her PhD on the topic of algorithmic bias in automatic speech recognition. And so we thought we'd like to get to know you and your work better, and is there a better way of doing it than getting you to talk about your research. So welcome, Nina. We've got an hour. We will talk for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, and then there'll be Q&A. And we're recording this session, so people should be aware of that. Okay, over to you, Nina. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and I'm really delighted to be joining this team, and yeah, very excited to be also talking about my research. So yeah, I'm currently sort of finishing up and about to submit my dissertation research about algorithmic bias in automatic speech recognition. And today I just wanted to give a sort of overview of both the, first of all, what that is, and also the sort of origins and impacts and mitigation that I've been working on from a bunch of different perspectives over the last couple of years. So to start off, let's see. To start off, I need to figure out if I can navigate the slides. There we go. To start off, the obvious question is, what is automatic speech recognition? So at its most basic, automatic speech recognition is the task at hand is mapping a sound sequence to a graphic representation. So this is now implemented in lots of different applications and domains. So personally, I am looking at it mostly agnostic of device. So I'm really interested in different kinds of applications. But obviously, lots of people have looked at voice user interfaces specifically on phones or in computers, or in terms of automatic transcription. You may also know it from automatic transcription for video and audio. So for instance, this talk is currently, I think, being automatically transcribed. Similarly, you get this on social media now as well. And then there's also applications such as in language learning and assessment as well. And so one of the very interesting things about automatic speech recognition right now is that it's sort of expanding in domain. So it's being used in many different kinds of devices, but it's also being used by a much wider user base than it has been before, by lots of different people in lots of different contexts. The data that is being used, so this is machine learning systems, so usually it requires some transcribed speech data or untranscribed speech data, depends a bit on the setup of the algorithm, for training, and some text data as well. And then I will come back to this. It also requires this for testing, which can be an issue. And it is now also being expanded in terms of the languages that it's being used for. So in the past, this was very much a domain of high resource languages, so like lots of language technologies. It was because of this data requirement of having specifically transcribed speech data. This is something that used to only be possible for some languages, not others. So particular English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, languages that have are sort of high resource in the sense that they have a very particular type of data available that is required to train these systems. But now we are seeing this also move into all kinds of languages, including so-called low resource languages, which are particularly interesting because they sometimes raise particular challenges, or rather expose particular flaws in the underlying assumptions that we have in these systems. But I will get to that later. First, I will briefly talk about predictive bias and algorithmic bias in ASR. So ASR performance, as I talk about it here, has been shown to differ by speaker gender, by speaker race, and by speaker region. So essentially, depending on who you are, these systems might not work equally well. So there's I'm going to get into the question of what is ASR and what is performance in a second. We've already sort of talked about the what is ASR question is quite tricky since there's lots of different application domains. The performance question is also quite tricky because there's lots of different ways of measuring performance. But essentially, as this graph shows, from quite an influential study from 2020 that was looking at conversational speech from sociolinguistic corpora in the US. So one of those corpora is the Voices of California project, which collects speech from mostly white speakers in California. And the other one is the Choral corpus, which is the corpus of African American language, which has speakers of African American language. And essentially, when they compared performance of 5 different US ASR systems, commercial ASR systems from Apple, IBM, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, they found the performance was significantly worse for the Black speakers across the board. And so that essentially renders these systems useless for a lot of people, in particular for black men who were using sort of a particularly high rate of dialect terms that were that the system just could not handle because it was not trained on that kind of speech. In my own research, I've sort of looked at this in the British context. So when you compare, the details of this graph are not that important, but essentially what matters is when you compare this performance of these kinds of systems across different varieties within the UK, you see a similar pattern where it works really well for very high status varieties, such as Standard Southern British English. So speakers from Cambridge in this context got quite low error rates, and speakers from Newcastle or Belfast or Liverpool got really high error rates. So again, you see this kind of performance difference. And then you, as you might expect, you also see this performance difference when you look at the differences between first language speakers of English and second language speakers of English, with much higher error rates for second language speakers of English as well. And so the reason why I was sort of interested in that is because my background is in sociolinguistics, and so I was interested in how these performance differences map on to the wider sociolinguistic context, to what we sort of know about how language differs and what we know about the status that different varieties have. So when I first set out to quantify these problems, there are obviously some key challenges. I wasn't the first to discover them either, but they are sort of noteworthy problems, such as having appropriate evaluation data sets in the first place. So finding out that there is predictive bias in any of these systems requires you to have a data set that notes all of the relevant characteristics in your test data set so that you can then compare performance, right? So for instance, that using Choral to test the US English systems reveals those biases. If you don't use Choral, then you don't know that. If you only use white speakers, then you wouldn't notice these problems. It also obviously has a question of sort of how these benchmarks then compare to real life users of these systems. Both of these problems are not specific to ASR, but a more general problem in machine learning broadly, where benchmarks are often not as representative as we would like them to be. And so one of the things that I've done recently that hopefully will improve on this somewhat is I was involved in a project where we compiled a corpus of international accents of English with a much wider range of different speakers included, in the hopes that you would then be able to discover these kinds of biases. The next problem is the problem of evaluation metrics, as I noted. So again, standard metrics like that metric that I showed you earlier, which is word error rate, essentially just tells you what percentage of words are wrong in a transcript. It doesn't really tell you what kind of errors you see, or it doesn't really tell you what the impact of those errors is. And moreover, these systems all rely on a sort of gold standard, which might seem really straightforward in the context of language. If you're sort of used to thinking about a language like English, you might have a very intuitive sense of what is a correct transcription and what is not a correct transcription. But in lots of languages, that standard, that linguistic standard, is a lot more contested. So people might not agree on how to spell something or how to transcribe something. Or there might be different ways of transcribing the same thing or spelling the same thing. And so in contexts where this is much more contested, this becomes a really fundamental flaw in the way that we evaluate these systems. So in order to then understand the sort of impacts and origins and sort of really why this matters, I think we need to sort of step back a bit and sort of understand the wider context, both from a sociolinguistic perspective and maybe from a sort of broader socio-technical systems perspective. So what I found really useful here was this formulation of these three lenses of understanding the consequences of algorithmic systems that Ezan et al. Discuss in a paper from FACT from last year, which is really worth reading also because of the sort of main point of the paper, which is not about this, but is about the impacts of the A-level grading algorithm that was used not just in the UK, but also globally applied in lots of other contexts. And they are talking about the Bangladeshi context where this was applied and the consequences it had there. But essentially what they highlight are these three big lenses in the research around this, especially within the FACT community, where you have a technical lens, a contextual lens, and an infrastructural lens, where the technical lens is sort of asking how was the system built and is trying to understand the consequences from that perspective. So this is all about dataset documentation and those kinds of questions, which I've also been raising in my own research, where I was sort of thinking about why is the dataset compiled in this way, or what could we know about this, or what would we have to know about this in order to evaluate it. Then you have the contextual lens, which is more about how is it reproducing existing inequities. So this goes back to this question of why do we see the same kind of sort of better performance for people who already have a lot of status, worse performance for people who don't. And then the infrastructural lens, which I'm still sort of trying to wrap my head around, is the thing that they are proposing as a new thing. I think it is not completely new in that lots of papers touch on it, or lots of research on contextual framings does touch on it, but it's, I think, an important larger question maybe to keep in mind, which is more about what's the wider context that requires this system, or makes it possible, or makes it work, or makes it not work. So that's sort of something to maybe keep in mind that I found useful. And then the other way I've been thinking about it is because I'm a linguist and a sociolinguist more specifically, is thinking about language variation and how language variation and language in society more generally relates to all of this. So I'm interested in how language relates to social identities and power and societies, and therefore language technologies is sort of an interesting way that an interesting player there. It sort of intervenes in this context a bit. So very briefly, language variation is fundamental to language. All language is characterized by variation. Language is constantly changing. One of the key insights is that language variation and language change is structured and socially stratified. So rather than being random, it connects to particular social positions. So you can sort of read it as a proxy to a particular type of social identity. So if you think of different, what William Labov famously referred to as different ways of saying the same thing, these different ways of saying the same thing very often relate to particular social groups. So maybe it's an index of being older or being younger, or of being from a particular social background or from a particular region. So in this way, this language variation carries social meaning and is also used by speakers agentively. So it's not just a marker of who I am or how I fit into the wider society, but it's also a marker of who I am that I can use quite agentively to sort of express who I want to be or who I affiliate myself with, rather than just being a sort of abstract, a sort of passive reflection of my wider social position. So in this way, these different ways of saying the same thing become indices for different ways of being in the world, for different social identities. And in order to understand this, we all sort of draw on and create these language beliefs, these beliefs about what kind of language different people use, and why that is. And so this is sort of where we get this belief about good or correct language use from, and conversely about sort of bad or lazy or otherwise wrong language use. And these kinds of attitudes are really important because they sort of, first of all, they reflect attitudes about speakers, usually not language as such, because the language by itself doesn't have, you can't attach the value to the language itself. It's the attachment between the speaker and the language. But also it's the basis of all kinds of real discrimination we see in the world today. So we see in the UK, for instance, accent discrimination for against second language speakers. We also see it against first language speakers. If you think about different accents that are used in the UK, you can probably think of different social attributes you would associate with them and which ones you would associate as pleasant or educated or prestigious and which ones you wouldn't. So in this way, we get what we call language ideologies. And the next important bit, how this sort of flows on, is that we have a concept called language management. And so the idea with language management is that this was really shaped by Bernard Spolsky, who talks about language management, and he talks about it as the modification of language use and language beliefs. So language beliefs is the bit I was just talking about, the sort of like what is good or appropriate language for a particular context. And language use is obviously the language variation. It's sort of how we talk. And both of these things are being shaped by management or policy. So you see this in particular maybe in schools where you're being taught very explicitly that this is an appropriate way to speak and this is an inappropriate way to speak. But you also see it in, say, multilingual settings where people negotiate which language to use in which context. And what I've come to think about recently is how technology designers and their institutions also are a kind of language management or language policy actor in the way that they decide which languages and which language varieties to support in their technology design, and which ones to not to support or to sideline. And so to sum up, we have these like three concepts here of language variation, language ideologies, and language management. And they all link together, and they're all sort of crucial in understanding how algorithmic bias works in the context of language technologies, because they tell us something about the harms and the impacts of that. So one of the critiques that has been raised about focusing on bias in machine learning is that bias can be very disconnected from impacts and harms. It can be a sort of very abstract and removed discussion of different error rates, for example, that doesn't really connect to the way people experience these systems and the actual impacts these different performances have. So in the context of ASR, if we take the knowledge of language variation and we know that different people speak in different ways because of reasons related to their identity, and they might already be marginalized because of the way that they speak in broader society, and then we tie that to this algorithmic bias in speech recognition, for example, we can see how that results in, say, alienation, where they feel, and there's these empirical studies that show that users of ASR systems feel really self-conscious when they interact with an ASR system and it doesn't understand them, in particular when they're already marginalized, right? So they might already feel insecure about their speech, and then the system doesn't understand them, and that sort of furthers this belief that they're not good speakers. Sort of more drastically, we see that these systems might not work for them, and then we have increasingly a lot of high stakes contexts, such as automatic screening for hiring systems, where you have these videos that you sort of submit to a website, and then it's being automatically screened by a larger AI system, which involves some automatic speech recognition and some natural language processing. And based on the judgments of that system, you are being ranked against other candidates. Now here, if the system doesn't understand you because of your speech, or otherwise if the system doesn't rank you highly because the way you speak isn't the way the system was trained to hear good speech, you might face some quite serious sort of harm, right? That might be a sort of economic or opportunity loss where you don't get a job, or maybe you're not ranked highly enough. And it's this interesting loop where because this is a machine learning system, you sort of risk encoding a lot of these biases that may already have been there in the hiring process. But if you're talking to a person, there's a lot you can sort of correct in communication if they don't understand you, or you can adjust your speech because you know who you're talking to. But in these systems, you might already feel extremely insecure if you don't know who you're talking to or what the system can and cannot understand. So in this way, there are these sort of quite direct harms. And then I think there are also broader cultural harms where these and other language technologies end up encoding beliefs about good and appropriate language beyond bias in a way that maybe we have seen in the way that sort of dictionaries work or other written media work, but it's a sort of interesting new domain where you see a representation of speech, or where a sort of either in written form, or where sort of some speech is being reinforced as appropriate and good, and one that this machine can process, and other is not. Other varieties, other languages, or other ways of speaking aren't. And in that way, it sort of reinforces these existing hierarchies that we already have of languages. And so one of the ways that I've been thinking about it is in terms of the origins of this, is in terms of data bias. So this is the thing that people always point you to, that the reason you have predictive bias is because you trained on a different kind of data set. This was also the finding that they came to in this context of this US study, where essentially their conclusion was that African-American speakers are just really underrepresented in both the text and the speech training data. And as a result, the system can't handle their speech. So that is a very sort of neutral way of framing it. Of course, there's not sort of neutral reasons why that is the case. So I think there's a point in asking, why is it in the first place that we have data sets that are so unrepresentative of the people who might be using the systems in the end? And so one of the things I've done recently was sort of think very carefully about asking these questions of how did it end up being this way, and what could be done to remedy this. So how could we create data sets that are more representative of people and the way that they use language, and what would that actually do? And so one of the ways that you can think about this is whose language is included, what language sort of seems common sense to include, who makes those decisions, and how do we think about language variation, and why is it that way? So here, the screenshot here is from Amazon's ASR engines that you can use and you can pay to use. And it's quite interesting because it's not a full list, I think, But it's quite interesting, not just which languages and language varieties they choose to include, but also the way that they frame them is quite interesting. So they're always linked to a particular place. Although then again, not all of them are linked to a particular place. So you have French, for example, and then you have French Canadian, which is quite interesting in the way that it very clearly marks one French as the real French and the other one is the Canadian French. And this is the kind of language ideology that is very subtle, but does have, I think, an impact on the way that we think about language and what it means to be a language or to speak a language. So one of the things that we were thinking about in this context is to go back to this question of language management and draw on that theory to understand what's happening here. And so me and a colleague were talking about language policy arbiters here, which is a term from Johnson & Johnson, who are language policy researchers. And essentially, the idea here was that developers in particular are at this interesting point where they sometimes might have quite a lot of power in the way that they implement make these decisions, especially in academic settings, perhaps where they're not operating under a lot of constraints, but might really be relying on their sort of common sense notions of what language to include or what kind of data to include when they train a system. And obviously, the other insight that I've already sort of touched upon here was that these systems aren't just shaped by what we already believe about language, but they then go on to shape what we believe about language in the sort of downstream effect. And also the way that we use language, because there are all of these studies that show that we adjust our speech when we interact with language technologies. And so this might be an increasing way that we end up accommodating to these machines in a way that we haven't before. Yes, so I've already talked about this earlier because I forgot this slide came up again. So we have this framing of languages being tied to particular places. This is particularly common. This is not just Amazon, but Google, for instance, does the exact same thing. Okay, so then the big question at the end is, I guess, so what do we do about this? So one way that we can go about this is to design more inclusive data sets. That's, I think, the sort of immediate reaction that we see a lot in the context of algorithmic bias, where people point out that there is a problem where systems don't work equally well for everyone, and the responses to train systems that can accurately process data for more different people. And in a way, I think that is a positive impulse, and definitely an impulse that I've also been a part of in my own research, where I've sort of, I think having more representative data sets is useful because it allows us to find bias. It allows us to build systems that are generally more useful and more flexible and more robust. At the same time, I think what is really key is to understand what language communities want and to figure out how to deal with the fact that languages and language communities aren't all the same. So Stephen Bird makes this point really well in his recent research, who on decolonizing speech technology research, and also here on this concept of local languages, where essentially he's arguing for understanding the context of a particular language rather than treating all languages as the same, understanding that some languages are used locally but might not be used between. So if you have multilingual contexts where speakers use lots of different languages, there might be some languages that are local that don't have a standardized script, for example, so they're not really written very much. If the language is not written very much, understanding how to build an ASR system is really tricky because you need this graphic representation. So you need to either create one or you need to draw on one, and all of that is a sort of quite complicated social process, because if you do it carelessly, you are sort of imposing a whole new way of writing a language. which is not really necessarily your business to be doing. But also, you might be missing the point in the sense that people might then reject that system in the first place, and it might not be successful. So what you need is this sort of understanding of how the language fits into people's lives, and also what language communities want. So I think one tension here that we have with sort of expanding language technologies as much as possible and giving sort of more equitable access to these technologies is that at the same time, language communities might not want that. So Maori is a very interesting case where the first article I've screenshotted here is from 2021, where this was sort of first becoming an issue. There was a media company that had created all of these, this nice corpus of Maori speech data from their radio station and from their listeners. And they were building their own ASR system. And then lots of big tech companies were trying to purchase that data from them. And they didn't want to be selling it because they didn't want them to be profiting off that data, because it's an indigenous language that was sort of, as they put it, beaten out of them, and therefore they didn't want it to be sold back to them. And then, as you can see, 2 years later, the recent OpenAI ASR system Whisper does actually work on Maori and was trained on Maori data, not on that same data that was that they tried to safeguard a couple of years ago, but on some other data that was probably found somewhere on the internet. But I think it raises this really interesting question of how to build equitable technologies, not just language technologies, that really center communities, especially where communities might not be aligned with the sort of broader aim of having, I don't know, open access technologies available, but rather would want to safeguard their own data and their own languages and be the sort of in charge and in control of who gets to profit off them as well. And then finally, of course, there's the other use case of ASR in particular, where having this better technology doesn't always equal less harm. So if you think about the way that ASR in particular can be used for surveillance, there is a real question to be raised whether it is better for marginalized communities to be understood better by these systems or worse. On the one hand, if they have lots of errors, that might lead to wrongful, to sort of bad outcomes for them because they were misunderstood. On the other hand, if they're better understood, then the surveillance works better as well. So in that way, I think that raises, a much more fundamental question, that understanding the broader sociolinguistic context perhaps helps you to navigate, but also doesn't quite help you to fully answer, because at the end of the day, I think there is a fundamental tension there between the question of, do we fix the narrow technical problem? Do we fix the contextual problem, or do we sort of take a look out at the wider use cases of these systems? And of course, being able to contain that upward is really tricky, both with data that is open source and with technology that is open source. It sort of becomes very questionable how you can control where and how it is being used. And I think that is the very pessimistic note I wanted to end on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If people want to switch their mics on and come in directly to conversation, there's a few of us enough that we can do that. Maybe stick your hand up if you're not shy enough, if you want to be brought in. While people are thinking of the question they want to ask, it seemed to me, I mean, in Britain,
yeah.
We use language in a very particular way, and we have regional differences which instantly convey class.
Yes.
But I know that, for example, Italians say that for them the regional accent identifies a regional subculture, but not class. Are there different social stratifications for different uses of language? Is social stratification a very particular thing to different kinds of cultures?
Yes, I think so. So a lot of the point about the UK is obviously very, very clear. A lot of the research on this has been focused on English, where you sort of tend to have that class. Also in the US, you tend to have a sort of social class coupling as well. And there were it's this interesting history of the field where people were always really interested in social class, and that's why we have all of this focus on social class rather than other kinds of meanings. But there is a lot of research that also sort of looks at the very particular local meanings, so much more so than just in different cultural contexts, but even within different communities of practice. So you get different social meanings. So there's lots of really famous studies that look at schools, for example, where using particular words or particular vowels relates to your attitudes toward authority within the school, or like within the sort of very local context. There's also similar research that is about sort of looking at your attitude towards the local politics or the regional politics, or whether you're in agriculture or you're in sort of more industrial working class jobs. So there's all of these different, much more fine-grained distinctions. And yeah, social class is definitely not instantiated in the same way everywhere, or expressed through language in the same way everywhere. That's definitely true.
Yes, absolutely. And are there people looking at, I mean, there are kind of subcultural, deliberately obscure subcultural uses of languages.
Yes.
And reverse use of language. I mean, my kids, well, kids I knew 10 years ago started talking about things as wicked.
Mm-hmm.
And now the counter uses are even more extreme. And in a sense, one of the implications of what you're saying is that we should be trying to make language more egalitarian and open, whereas actually people are using it to, as you say, construct identities and
Yes,
produce in-groups and out-groups.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that's what makes building these technologies so difficult, because people are, or I mean, it's not a problem with the people more so than it's a problem with the way that we approach the problem, I guess. In that small groups of people use language in such particular ways that a system built for a larger group might not work at all. And that you might see this in different accents. You also see this, hate speech detection is a really good example, right? Where hate speech detection assumes that some slurs are always negative, and doesn't realize that people also can use words in a sort of they can reappropriate words in a sort of affirmative way and a positive way. And so they're not always a slur, but that depends on who is using it. And that is the bit that you can't really get at as a developer. Like, that is the bit that is really difficult to get at from an automated systems perspective. But essentially, yes. So because language is this really important thing for people to construct identities, we need to be really careful with it. But also, because there is an infinite amount of small social groups, it will never work for everyone, and trying to engineer for that is very difficult.
Which is very interesting. I mean, I've got text recognition on speech recognition on this call, but I bet if I use the N word, it will not come up.
That's the other thing, right? So that's another really interesting question, where at what point should or shouldn't it transcribe that, and should that, and how do you make that decision?
But I know, there are lots of black kids I know who will use that as a positive expression.
Exactly. And that's I think that's where it becomes really complicated, right?
Interesting.
Hi, Nina. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for this fantastic talk. I really enjoy it. One thought, well, I'm very linked with what Robin has said in terms of language variation not only is about accent, but also how you say things.
Yes.
You can say I mean, a same phrase can have different meanings depending how you say it, right? Is that also contemplated in this type of variations? That's one point, and the other point is related to more contextual things related to sarcasm, for example. And it's the case of my children. My children were raised here, and they speak Spanish. They speak correct Spanish, but they don't understand humor in Latin American humor, or Mexican humor, or Costa Rican humor, because it's very context oriented, and they weren't raised there. I think that is another dimension of difficulty, right?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. And I think there's a sociolinguist, Del Himes, who talks about communicative competence. So this is a sort of response to earlier in linguistic research. There was always this focus on sort of language competence, which is very narrowly focused on sort of being able to produce the correct words in the correct order. But there is this much wider sense, as you say, of communicative competence that is about being able to have an appropriate tone and to understand this kind of humor and to use language in all of these like much more complicated ways. And I think we are not, so in sociolinguistics, we are thinking about this. I think we're thinking about variation in style a lot more, but maybe less about variation in sort of intonational variation that conveys social meaning. I think people do look at, but it's sort of maybe less integrated than a lot of the other work. That's true. But I think in the context of language technologies, we are very far from addressing these kinds of problems. So in ASR, it's not as much of an issue because most of the time what you want is a transcript and you don't really care about the actual intended meaning behind it. So you're not, that might be different if you're interacting with like a smart speaker, then you might want to convey that meaning. But a lot of the time you don't, and so it doesn't matter. But yes, I think if it gets to this question of like, can you be sarcastic with your smart speaker? You probably can't, because it probably doesn't.
It's like that. When you are reading a WhatsApp message, the person who put the tonality or the intensity is the reader, right? It's the receptor. So yeah, that is
absolutely
a huge source of complications as well.
Yeah, and that is also something that like really varies between cultures, right? So that's also an interesting thing that sort of becomes complicated in that way if you're not used to it and you don't know how to interpret it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to go back to this question of race. I mean, we're looking at medical technology.
Yeah.
Lung cancer screening, and it's being rolled out to English hospitals. And the Birmingham radiologist who's about to implement it is saying, well, she's not sure whether the training data set that has been used to train this screening device is going to be adequate for the particular ethnic composition of Birmingham, with many Asian and African, well, Afro-Caribbean peoples, and then then it raises the question about how one would deal with issues of racial equity in data sets. Now, it may be simpler. It may not come up in your work because, in a sense, you're interested in linguistic usages. So that's a kind of, and that's a feature of a community other than a biological feature. So I guess Africans are very genetically diverse, and they're linguistically diverse, but probably less markedly so than their genetic diversity. But if you've got an internal difference that you can't really readily interrogate. But have you done any work on how it is you would attempt to come to a conclusion about adequacy, ethnic representativeness of training data sets?
Yeah, so in the context of ASR, it's a bit, yeah, as you say, it's a bit easier, or in the context of language technologies, because you can just look at, you can try and pinpoint where the system breaks down. And people have done this really, really successfully. So especially this is now a new interest amongst sociolinguists and sociophoneticians who really carefully look at where the system makes a mistake, and then because of what we know about language variation, we can trace that back to, so if you have a word that it doesn't recognize properly, and you can look at the vowel and you can sort of reconstruct, oh, this is the vowel that it expected here. This is how it expected the person to pronounce this word. And that means that it was trained on this particular kind of data set, right? It was trained on a different variety. So that's easier to do in a way. And it's easier to do because we have these clusters of features that we know that sort of characterize one dialect versus another dialect. And in this way, it becomes a lot more straightforward. And as you also highlighted, it's a bit more complicated because language, these dialects are sort of related to ethnic identities, but they're not the same. And they're also related to social class and to region and to all of these other things. So the answer is, I think it's in a lot of ways easier in language technologies than it is elsewhere. I know in the context of facial recognition type analysis, people have, Timnit Gebru has done some work on this, where they were essentially creating more diverse and sort of balanced data sets, where they were just using, so in this case, it was about different skin tones. So they were just classifying people by a sort of standardized skin tone standard category. And that was mostly used to actually reveal those biases as well. So they used it to test the systems and sort of highlight the problems. So I think it depends a bit on, I guess, on what signal the system is picking up on, and what sort of systematic variation you could expect. So in the context of language, you might expect systematic variation between white Americans and Black Americans in the way that they use language generally, and therefore you can then sort of think about, if it only recognizes the white speakers, or if it's only trained on the white speakers, what does it miss amongst the Black speakers? But that obviously depends on the specific application of what it is that, you know, and if you don't know, then it becomes really difficult. If you don't know what the expected differences are, or if there are any expected differences, then it becomes really difficult.
Yeah, and I guess not all Black Americans are, you know, where do the Black Americans come from?
Yeah, no, totally. And not all of them speak African American language, right? So this is, and African American language itself is like a really broad term on purpose. So there's lots of variation within that as well. So in the context of speech technologies, I think it always makes sense to build smaller specific models, but I know that is very much going against the overall trend, which is going towards massive models that work for everything. But I think that is, you know, risky in a lot of different ways.
Yes. Are there any other questions that people want to raise? How do you deal with the situation in China, by the way, in Chinese language? Because you've got Chinese language as it's written is not a representation of Chinese language how it's spoken. And does that have particular issues?
So I haven't really looked at all into ASR in Mandarin, to be honest. I do know, and I don't know that much about the sociolinguistic context. What I do know is that it is a really interesting case, in that there is this strong standard that is very much imposed by the government as a sort of like, this is the standard that everybody speaks and writes. But then you have this huge linguistic diversity of these dialects or languages that are closely related somehow, but aren't accents or dialects in the same way that we see within English, for example. But the short answer is that I don't know enough about the context to tell you very much how it works.
It's deeper than that, because how people write is not how they speak.
Yes, yeah, but that's I mean that is the case for
very different.
Yes, so I think that raises that sort of question of how do you even begin to represent these, and in the case of, I actually don't know how that works in Mandarin at all.
Interesting. So social linguistic tools, however, might be quite interesting tools for social inquiry.
Yes.
Perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it's time to stop and to thank you very much for an interesting presentation, and we look forward to seeing you when you come up to Edinburgh next, which we hope next week. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk and admirable.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.